with the building of the Shard, this part of North Southwark is yet again going through a complete transformation, you know, and I was just saying to Michael, it feels completely different already to what I was used to 10, 20 years ago when I worked here as an archaeologist, and with the completion of the Shard and all the work around London Bridge, it's going to transform again. So it struck me it was a good opportunity to walk around this area. And what we're going to do over the next 2 or 3 hours is we're going to kind of do a kind of figure of 8 shape with the George Inn at the middle of the figure of 8. So what we're going to do is walk westwards through North Southwark as far as Bankside and Tate Modern, and ending with the Shakespearean theatres, and then we're going to kind of double back on ourselves to Borough High Street and the George, and we're going to have lunch in the George. Then the bonus feature is Michael, who has worked at Guy's over different periods of time, 56 years, and is going to take us in and give us a little insight into Guy's Hospital, and then we'll come out the other side of that and head eastwards up as far as Bermondsey, and then come back round City Hall and finish back around here. And it should, if all goes to plan, be about an hour and a half from here until lunch, about an hour for lunch, and then about another hour and a half at the other end, something like that. We'll see how we go. So first, in a moment, what we're going to do is we're going to go down to Borough High Street and talk more there about the topography of the area and the Roman topography. But it's worth noting up here that this part of North Southwark, it's almost impossible now to work out what its original topography was, or even its early geography. And where we are here, we're kind of 2 false layers up. So the whole area leading up to London Bridge was built up as a sort of embankment to get London Bridge over to the city. And then it's all been built up again for the railway. And where we're standing here is in effect a 19th century brick creation that brought the railway into this area. So it's very difficult to get the relationship between Southwark and the, if you like, historic Southwark and its relationship to the city and what's going on now. And that's very much because of London Bridge and now the Shard. And it's worth, so mentioning London Bridge is a really weird, messy station, and it kind of makes sense that it is because it was originally the home of 3 different railways. I forget exactly, it was the London and Greenwich, which was the first actual passenger railway in London. Then there was the Croydon Railway, and I think the Maidstone or the Brighton. There were 3 different railways that ended up as 2 railways. One that sort of carries on as a through route from sort of Greenwich all the way through to Cannon Street and Charing Cross, and the other one that terminates here. And through the 19th century, different configurations were put together. And that destroyed this area historically because of this huge sort of brick construction that had to be built to allow the railway to come in on a level keel. Somebody once told me, it's one of those facts you never quite trust, that if you consider it a building or a structure, the brick railway viaduct that in effect goes from Charing Cross all the way to New Cross is one of the largest brick structures in the world. And if you think about it,
practically Greenwich.
Greenwich, yeah. And if you think about it, it is huge structure. There was once, as with all the big railway stations, a very fine hotel on this site, the London Bridge Hotel, that was built in the mid-19th century. Great, grand entrance hall, many buildings, complete failure. Nobody ever stayed there, and it's because actually there's no distance you go from here, so you don't really need a hotel. So it was taken over and used as offices by the railway, and then very seriously damaged in the war and pulled down. The station was also badly damaged in the war, was rebuilt in the 60s and 70s. Pevsner, amazingly, is quite generous to it, but it was really a horrible place. But it's now being completely rebuilt again with the planning gain that has come from the Shard. So actually, for the first time ever in a couple of years, this actually might be quite a nice space. The Shard itself, finished in February, built since 2009, a kind of rather obvious that sooner or later there would be a building like this here, with it being so difficult to build really tall buildings in the city. 79 floors, I think. As you will all know, the architect is Enzo Piano, the Italian architect. The tallest building in the European Union, replaced a building in Frankfurt. Who can tell me where the largest building in Europe is?
This one.
Moscow. Moscow's got the largest building. Interestingly, this is not the tallest man-made freestanding structure in the United Kingdom, which is... Anyone? Oh, no. This is the tallest building by far in Europe. The tallest freestanding tower in England is the Emley mast in Kirklees in West Yorkshire, which is for broadcasting signals. Which even I went, oh, God, yes, it is tall. I didn't realise it was that tall. Owned by Qatar. So all the money from the Middle East. But it is an incredible thing. Not yet full, but these buildings are designed for several recessions. And most of us remember Canary Wharf, which was a complete failure to start with, and everyone said, oh, it'll end up a bit like Croydon, and now is sucking the life out of the city. But it has become already this major part of the London landscape. English Heritage were initially incredibly rude about it. They were the people who called it a shard of glass in London that gave it its name, the Shard. The architect actually talked about it being inspired by the floating spires of Wren in the city. One would suggest he hadn't got his sense of proportion quite right when he was making that comparison. So here we are up on this raised brick platform. What we're now going to do is, if you like, descend down, both in history and physically, down to Borough High Street, and when we're down there, talk about the earlier landscape. When I worked here as an archaeologist, I was always amazed that when you do the site datum, it was always about naught. You know, you're about 0 to 1 metre above sea level here. It's really low. And that's the other key thing about understanding North Southwark. The one time I'm going to use a visual aid. This is North Southwark in terms of in the Roman period. We're about here, and you can see the brown areas are above sea level, and the blue is below. So the natural topography of Southwark is most of it is underwater most of the time. And the only reason the London is there and Southwark is here, when the Romans invaded, thank you, are you happy to, when the Romans invaded, they bypassed this area and crossed the Thames at Westminster, where it was fordable, and then went round to the north of London on the way up to Colchester. But then when they wanted to form a trading post, they looked at this area and they identified the North Bank as being a nice high area with a nice steep bank, and that they spotted these islands where you could bring a road up to the river and bridge it. So it was a very pragmatic engineering solution to locate London there and bridge it over. And they then moved the roads, so you've got Watling Street, the A2 from Canterbury coming up here, the A3 Staines Street, Chichester. They brought them up here, they meet at the bottom of Borough High Street and then literally jump over these islands to come up to this point for the bridge. And what they then started doing was building revetments and banks to create solid ground here, and a small suburb built up. And that's what gave us Roman Southwark. And indeed, because that was the point where London Bridge was, and where the roads were, everything that came after. So at the end of the Roman period, obviously it became abandoned, but when the Saxons came back, the roads were still there, the city was still there, and it kind of took off again. And this road, Borough High Street, is directly over this Roman road. And in a minute we'll go out again. If you look down, you can see a curve, and it's this curve here. And it still goes back to that point of them very cleverly building this road through these sandy islands. What you also realise is that a lot of the rest of the area at high tide was underwater. It would have felt completely different to how it does now. So when we're up at Tate Modern, we'll be walking over areas that in the Roman period would have been underwater at high tide. To give you a feel of this watery world, the Guy's Tower next to the Shard, which is here, a full ocean-going Roman boat was found there when that tower was being put up. So we're not just talking, shallow water, we're talking very, very deep channels. And we have to think of the Thames being kind of twice as wide, even at high tide, 3 or 4 times as wide at low tide. Archaeologically, we know that there is this Roman suburb through excavations that go back to the 50s, but continue through the 70s and 80s along Borough High Street. And the most important excavations here were under the area where the Jubilee line was put, actually under Borough High Street in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, where the whole road and major sets of shops, as you'd expect, on either side. So we know we have Roman occupation from quite early in the mid-1st century AD. So we got our earliest dates in the city about 48 AD. Almost immediately there is some settlement in Southwark. Down that line of Borough High Street, we do appear to have Boudiccan burning in Southwark along with the city. The exact relationship between Londinium and Southwark we don't really understand, and archaeologically it was always dug by separate people. Kathleen Kenyon dug in Southwark in the 50s and 60s. Then in the 70s and 80s it was Harvey Sheldon and his team. Southwark and Lambeth Archaeological Excavation Committee then became the Department of Greater London Archaeology that finally did morph into Museum of London Archaeology Service. And ironically, only now, when you have a single unit, it doesn't make much sense anymore because you then have contracting archaeology. And the first ever piece of archaeology dug in London, not by a London unit, was in Southwark by the Oxford Archaeological Unit. I remember at the time all being horrified at the time, and now, of course, it's just absolutely natural. But then we also have got here Southwark Cathedral. So Southwark Cathedral started as a convent, I think, according to records, in the 6th century, but we know it was an Augustinian priory from the early 13th century. But it was never a great, or it always seemed to be in trouble, and it was always falling apart. At the dissolution, it became the parish church for this part of Southwark, St Mary Overy, and then it took in another parish and became the only church in this area, but was clearly far too big to be a parish church, and by the 19th century it was more or less in ruins and was more or less completely rebuilt. And it's a great shame that almost everything you see actually is Victorian, is rebuilt, but in the heart there is a medieval church, and it is an important church. That church and this area, and then London Bridge, the London Bridge station, cover up a lot of the Roman town. So a big chunk of where we would expect to be the core of the Roman settlement, we've never had a look at because of London Bridge. And the few tantalising glimpses we have had prove that there is stuff there. So, when we put in trenches as part of the Jubilee line, we got some very impressive mosaics and other remains underneath London Bridge, so there's big complexes there. And the only opportunity to look at archaeology in the cathedral, which was, they were doing something in the middle of it, there was a well Roman well, and out of it came this incredibly interesting, we always call it the hunter god figure, and it's what appears to be a Romano-Celtic statue of a god with a deer and a hound and wearing one of these Phrygian caps, but in a quite naive style. So it is kind of truly Romano-Celtic. So, and it also obviously begs the question as to whether there was some kind of Roman religious complex underneath the later foundation. But this church and its precincts, wherever they happen to be, have obviously taken up quite a part of this area. It was from here that St Thomas's Hospital, which was back on the London Bridge side, was founded, and we'll look at again when we're back on that side. So, as with a lot of London, religious buildings and complexes taking up quite a lot of the suburbs. And then the other thing you had in this area were big townhouses. And what we're going to do now is go back round and stop again at Winchester Palace, the Bishop of Winchester's London Palace. So we are now at Winchester Palace, one of the most stupid bits of this ridiculous area. Heaven knows why you can't walk there, but you can't, so it's rather odd. So what we're looking at is the west wall of the Bishop of Winchester's Great Hall, which formed part of Winchester Palace. And Winchester Palace was a complex of buildings that, in this case I do know, went in that direction, and just the other side here there's Winchester Square. So it was laid out a bit like a religious complex with sort of squares and cloisters. Most of the big bishops had London houses. The other really obvious one, of course, is Lambeth Palace, which still survives. And a lot of them were on the South Bank. This was the Bishop of Winchester's palace. Very important person at that time. In fact, where we are now fell within the Diocese of Winchester, so within his territory. First here in the 12th century and lasted through to the 17th century, by which time it was sold and broken up into smaller plots. So you can imagine the floor of the hall is where those three doors are, and those three doors would have led into the sort of pantries and kitchens. So the service bit, the other side of the wall, the hall this side, and then a vaulted basement, which is down there, which would have been for storage, and then other spaces in that direction, and then the river, straight onto the river here at that time in the medieval period. That wall, and what you see is mainly 13th, 14th century, and the window, the very beautiful rose window, is considered to be 14th century. These were all kind of completely lost in amongst warehouses, and then were rediscovered in the 50s, I think as late as no, actually it was earlier than that. It was known in the 19th century. But this area was cleared, and there were the major excavations here of the medieval area, but also very important late Roman remains here. Never really fully understood, but a big complex of late Roman stone buildings, very impressive mosaic floors, and incredibly impressive wall plaster. And if ever you go to the Museum of London, it was put back together as one of these wall paintings that fell face down, so we could do that thing of put plaster on the back and lift it up, and it had two complete decorations, one of which had been put on top of the other, and they would be able to separate out. The later one is a rather nasty pink garish thing, but the earlier one, you have to really go, I mean, the equivalents are at Pompeii, and it's incredibly fine architectural, three-dimensional sort of stuff. So very, very impressive complex of buildings. The lurid part of the story, which you will all know about Bankside, the Bishop of Winchester had a liberty, so he had land that he could do with whatever he wanted to here. And more generally, people could get up to stuff in Southwark that you couldn't get up to in the city. So you tended to put stuff over here that you didn't want in the city. So what Southwark became famous for were its prisons, and we've got the Clink prison, and this is Clink Street, and the name Clink comes from the Clink prison here. The Clink prison, we don't know exactly where it was, but some of it was the other side of this building, And actually, probably at different times, it was different buildings and several buildings. There were a number of other prisons, the Marshalsea, and associations with Dickens and others. Prisons, lots of pubs, brothels, and of course, again, famously for the Bishop of Winchester and the Bishop of Winchester's geese, which was a euphemism for the brothels that the Bishop of Winchester owned and controlled and took revenues from, and also theatres and bear baiting. And again, remembering that the Thames, which we see as a barrier, through most of its history, the bridges were pretty much irrelevant, and what you did was took boats from the different stairs. So it was a very normal practice to come from the city across to Southwark to get up to all the things you weren't allowed to do in the city. So here we are at Bankside, and by now we are way out of the Roman town, and in that area that in prehistory and indeed the Roman period would have been underwater, although there does appear to have been a kind of unoccupied sandy island under where Bankside Power Station is. And the name Bankside is just that, it's a bank. In the medieval period they built a bank in order to reclaim this land, but it was still very much marginal land. And what they did do in the early post-medieval period, this was rife for development, and what was developed here were pleasure gardens and the famous theatres. So underneath, I say Bankside Power Station, it's Tate Modern, were what were known as Paris Gardens, pleasure gardens, and what you would do is get your boat from the city over in and disembark and go into the gardens. They were wooded, and they were famous for spying. It's where you met spies, and you can imagine the other sorts of things you did in the dark under the trees. And as we said, there were lots of brothels here, and there were also the inns, and then there were the theatres. And famously, four theatres here, the Rose at the end of the 16th century, which we'll visit in a moment, then the Swan, and the Swan was built just the other side of Paris Garden, so somewhere at the western end of the Tate, then the Globe, which we will visit, and then finally the Hope, which was also known as the bear baiting arena, which tells you all you need to know. So it would double up as a theatre for Shakespearean theatre, but also for bear baiting, and the Hope was literally just here. So in this very small area, four of these theatres. Before Paris Gardens were there appeared to have been fish ponds. They were known as the pike ponds, so they would have had beef as fisheries to supply the city. But incredibly marshy, horrible digging round here, disgusting conditions, but you did get very good organic preservation. I think we found a Tudor wheelbarrow once that is now, I was at the Weald Downland Museum, and they've got a lovely wheelbarrow. I thought, oh, that's great. We had one of those. He said, yep, it's based on your one. And then, of course, what we've now got is the modern Globe Theatre, built by Sam Wanamaker in the 80s and 90s. Sam Wanamaker, the American actor and director, who had this obsession that how on earth could a country like England that had given us Shakespeare not be marking its importance. It took an American to do it. And incredibly ironically, just as they were starting that, we found the Rose Theatre. And in an absolute classic, what should have been this wonderful marriage actually got quite touchy and nasty between the archaeologists finding the Rose, and both saw each other as a kind of threat. Working here in the 1980s, it was dead. This area was dead. It was deserted warehouses, nothing. And to see what it is like now, I spend a lot of my life now persuading people to invest in arts and culture, because it really makes a difference to the economy. And all I need to do is bring them to Bankside, and see the transformation that has taken place here, and the number of people here. And then also worth noting here, in terms of modern planning, the western part of the city planning incredibly strict for the sight lines to St Paul's. You can't build anything which in any way interferes with, well, we can't see it because this bloody thing's in the way, but typical me. But sight lines to St Paul's, whereas the east of the city, more and more large buildings. And this thing you can see, which they call the cheese grater, which has got the slope. You think that rather odd angle. That is all about, actually, again, the sight lines to St Paul's from that direction. That when you're sort of Fleet Street looking in this direction, that building couldn't have come any further this way because it would have interfered with the sight lines, which is why it's got that angle. And there's this interesting thing going on now about the City of London, how it competes with Canary Wharf, and whether we're going to have more and more of those sorts of buildings, or what's going to happen. And of course, going back to the Shard is also a response to that. Okay, so this is the site of the Rose Theatre. So I'm sure all of you are familiar, but we're talking about these sort of hexagon-shaped theatres. At this period, coming out of the medieval period, there were two kind of models for theatres, the kind of inn type, long and thin and rectangular, or these more amphitheatre types that thought would be kind of based on bear baiting kind of arenas. And the very first one in London was the theatre, which was up in Shoreditch, and then the second was the Rose that was here. And then, as I said, the theatre was actually dismantled in Shoreditch and used to build the Globe, and the other two I mentioned, the Hope and the Swan. And it was that great period of Elizabethan theatre which gave us Marlowe and Shakespeare and all of those other fine folk. It was all commercial, you know, they all did it as businessmen, building the theatres, and then it was suppressed during the Commonwealth, and that was the end of that particular period, and then it would come back. So the Rose, in the 1980s, all of this area largely derelict warehouses. Planning permission for this building, Rose Court, as it became known, because it's on Southwark Bridge, nice and close to the city for offices. The Museum of London knew that this was probably the site of the Rose, so we negotiated a 10-week evaluation. Within the first couple of weeks, it was pretty clear not only was the Rose still there, but it was incredibly well preserved. And in effect, we got 2/3 of the ground plan of the Rose Theatre. And that poster there, which has got Marlowe and Shakespeare in the middle, is superimposed onto a kind of plan. So we had the entire outer wall and inner wall and stages and evidence for its rebuilding. It was an incredible preservation, but incredibly embarrassing because we had this 10-week deal. It all went completely belly up. We fell out with the developers, we fell out with English Heritage, we fell out with Southwark. It got incredibly nasty, and it got a huge amount of publicity. Every day there would be a new, you know, Dustin Hoffman or Superman, or, you know, someone would be down here, Charlton Heston. The English Shakespearean actors, Peggy Ashcroft, James Fox, Ian McKellen, all got incredibly involved, which gave it a kind of the sort of publicity, which meant, you know, you had to come up with a solution. I remember being down here one day, thousands of people with Victor Belcher from English Heritage, you know, standing up and saying, "You don't really think we can do anything, can you?" and being more or less shouted down. The compromise was that the remains were preserved below the building. A big sort of space was created, and the building was put up. The remains are there, under sand, under concrete, in a space, and have been there since 1989. And it's kind of so pathetic that you know, a country like United Kingdom can allow that to happen. It's unbelievable. And for those whatever it is, 20 or so years, the Rose Theatre Trust, purely amateurs, have maintained an exhibition and slowly tried to raise funds to do something. And just literally in the last year, they've had a grant from English Heritage to complete the excavation. So 2/3 are under here. The final third is kind of under the railway arches here. The long-term plan is to fully excavate it and preserve it in a way that it can be viewed. But it is problematic. It is timber and clay. It's not stone. It will be very, very difficult. And it will be one of those cases where, in order to preserve it, it will have to be dismantled. So whatever you end up with afterwards actually won't be the Rose Theatre. It's one of those really, really tricky cases. Because the globe was always more famous, more effort was put into locating the globe, and that the plaque that is on the bronze plaque that you would have seen was here way back, you know, locating the globe. But it also, all of this area that we're going to walk through in a minute was part of the Courage Brewery. It was all industrial area. You've got some Georgian buildings here. But this area was cleared, ironically, only a year, 1989, after we found the Rose. And it did allow for a small archaeological evaluation here, and we did identify again parts of the globe here. But the majority of the theatre is underneath this, these listed Georgian buildings. So there's never been full excavation, but there has been these plaques put up, and there is some markings in the road there. So we have got the globe here. And so this entire complex we just walked through, which is now all social housing, God bless it, was the Courage Brewery, huge brewery complex that went out of use, I guess, in the 70s, and then the 80s was derelict and was redeveloped. And we're just back into the Roman settlement, because underneath this building here, we found a completely conserved floor of a wooden Roman warehouse, completely preserved. So just on the very edge of one of those islands. But if you think of, you know, a warehouse here and where we are compared with the river, you know, they would have brought boats in here. St Thomas's Hospital, founded in the 12th century as obviously a religious hospital, and then surviving all the way up until the 19th century. The white building you can see through here, which does front onto Borough High Street, was the southern walled wing of St Thomas's Hospital, and there was an equivalent building to the north which was demolished for London Bridge Station. And then Guy's Hospital, which is on this side, was founded because, as I understand it, that Thomas's was kind of overcrowded and needed. But what I'm now going to do for the next half hour or 20 minutes is hand over to Michael, who's going to introduce us to Guy's Hospital.
Yeah. The only thing I'd say about St Thomas's was that it survived until the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries, and then it was a derelict for a number of years, and then Edward VI refounded it, and before it was dedicated to St Thomas a Becket. But after the Reformation, it changed to St Thomas the Apostle, because St Thomas the Becket is no longer fashionable. But Thomas Guy, he became a freeman of the Stationers' Company and a liveryman, and his statue there is actually in the Stationers' Company livery gown. He was elected as sheriff of the City of London. It actually says he was a sheriff in your handout, but I subsequently discovered that he was elected but never took it up, because he didn't want to be in line to become Lord Mayor, and he wasn't prepared for the expense involved. So he was actually fined by the City of London for not taking up his role as sheriff. And then he was an MP for Tamworth from 1695 to 1708. He actually made his money he was a bookseller in Cheapside, and he sold imported English language Bibles from Holland. But that wasn't allowed. And when that was banned, he did a deal with Oxford University to print Bibles for Oxford University, who did have a license to print English Bibles. And that was one of his fortunes, and the other was the South Sea bubble. He bought at the bottom and sold at the top and made an enormous amount of money. Anyway, he was the governor of St Thomas's Hospital, which occupied the site on the other side of the road. And in 1722, he leased the land to the south here. And £999-year lease for £30 a year, and that's still being paid. And this here is an alcove from the old London Bridge, the one that was knocked down in 1831 or something like that. And I went into store somewhere, and it was bought by the hospital, I can tell you when, for 10 guineas in 1861, so it sat somewhere for 30 years. And then it was erected here in 1926. The statue of John Keats. John Keats was a medical student of Guy's, and he actually qualified as an apothecary from Guy's, and worked for a while on the wards, but he very quickly gave that up. And there was no statue of Keats anywhere in the world until 2003 or 4, when we commissioned this, and this is by Stuart Williamson. It's 4% bigger than Keats was. And it was opened by the Poet Laureate in 2005, I think. And the alcove refurbished.
And we're now in Bermondsey, and Bermondsey, the traditional, as I said, industry of Bermondsey was leather making. And we're going to go that way, and I'll talk a little bit more about why. But the core of the leather industry are these two buildings, the leather market here, which has two entrances, one at either end where the carts went in and out, where you actually bought and sold leather market, and then the exchange, it says here, the London Leather and Hide and Wool Exchange, beautiful building, and you can see in both 19th century buildings, you can see in the round doors as you walk round these really nice depictions of different parts of the tanning and leather market trade. But now both obviously long gone in terms of that use, and now taking on different uses. This one, as you can see, office and studios. Okay, so here we've crossed Bermondsey Street. So Bermondsey Street is running vaguely north-south, and we're into, yet again it's hidden, but Tanner Street. This is Tanner Street. So we're right at the very heart of the tannery quarter of London. Now Bermondsey Street is a medieval street, and initially you think it appears to be running from nowhere to nowhere, but what it's really doing is running from Bermondsey Abbey. So if we were to go another couple of hundred yards in that direction in the medieval period, we would come to the Cluniac house of Bermondsey Abbey, one of the richest and finest medieval houses in Britain. Incredibly fine, completely demolished at the Reformation and now invisible. There is one hinge of a gate from the outer precincts, but nothing else. Although now pretty well excavated in the 80s and since. And if ever you're down that way, the crossing of Tower Bridge Road, which we'll come to in a minute, and Abbey Street is more or less the crossing of the Abbey. So when you drive down Abbey Street, you're driving down the nave of Bermondsey Abbey. And there was a parish church, as often there was, associated with the Abbey, which is still at the end of this street. So what this did, Bermondsey Street, was link the Abbey and the Abbey complex up to the river. But this also became, in the early post-medieval period, the tanning quarter of London. If you look at most cities for a tanning quarter, you need lots of fresh flowing water, you need access to the raw material, the animals, and you need to be downwind of the people. And where we are here, with westerly winds, we're downwind of all the people who are over there, and there's plenty of fresh water, the Neckinger stream, which also run in this area. So this is where the tanning industry built up, Tanner Street. And if you dig a hole anywhere in this area archaeologically, you will find tanning pits and the remains of tanning, and vast amounts of horn cores and bones. And all around here, I've done digs. And as late as the 50s and 60s, there was still just about a tanning industry here, footballs, some other stuff. I came to the last tannery that was still operating, I think it was 1986. It was just round here. We were digging a site, and these people came out and said, what are you doing? As they do, and we explained and said, well, that's really interesting because we are a tannery. So we went in, and it was dealing with exotic skins, and it was dealing with ostrich and frog and snake, and it was basically bringing them in, turning them into handbags and such things, and sending them straight back to the Middle East. And the only reason it was the last surviving one because it was dealing in this very high-end exotic. And I believe me, in that tannery there were things that looked like something out of Dante's Inferno. You know, big guys stripped to the waist, stirring vats of snake skins, and rows and rows and rows of women who looked like they were working sewing machines, but what they were doing was buffing skins. It was an incredible thing. And I said that was about 1986 or 87. That is now a hotel. The tanning industry is completely gone, all gone, you know, to parts of the world where labour is cheaper. But this is the tanning quarter of medieval and later London. So yet again, without labouring the point, yet again we find ourselves surrounded by early 20th century social housing. So yet again, more evidence of the attempts to clear the slums and do something about this what was an incredibly poor part of London. And of course, we only have to go a few hundred yards in that direction, and we're in the Rookeries and you know, Oliver Twist and Fagin and all that. So this whole area, you know, famous for how poor it got and the attempts to help it out. And of course, one of the ways you help places out were with churches. And what we're looking at here are what's left of St John's, Horselydown, which was an early 18th century church, which was the last of the churches. So you had Wren's churches, then you had the churches that followed by Hawksmoor, the ones in East London, some of which we saw last year, and then Hawksmoor did two churches with John James, this one and the one in Old Street. And by that time, you couldn't help feeling he was getting a bit kind of almost like a bit blasé and a bit experimental. And the one in Old Street had a kind of obelisk as a spire. This one famously had a column, a broken column that tapered, and it was just really odd looking, but was a landmark. Unfortunately, it was completely destroyed in the war by bombing, but I do think actually what they've done is incredibly sympathetic, and this is, it's a mission building, but the way that they've used the foundation and been sympathetic to the proportions of the church and the vicarage, which is just there, I think are incredibly nice. Only 15 years ago, this area was completely derelict warehouses that are left over from the Port of London, and this complete transformation with City Hall surrounded by offices still going up. You saw that we walked through something called Potter's Fields. That's named after where this building is going up here. There was a Delftware in the 17th, 18th century, a Delftware pottery kiln. There was a whole series of those Delftware Tinglaze kilns along the Thames. There was a major one here. Archaeologically, again, we're outside that core area, so we're into that sort of wet, marshy area. So all of this area in the early Roman medieval, nothing here at all, you're underwater. Early post-medieval, slowly being reclaimed. Fish ponds, moats, mills, and two quite major houses. The Rosary, which was a royal house based here with a moat round it, and also a house that was traditionally known as Falstaff's house and was indeed associated with Sir John Falstaff, the character in Shakespeare. And I always think it's quite nice that City Hall and Boris should be underneath Falstaff's house. I'm sure there's no connection at all. So this complex of warehouses here were built in the 1850s under the design of Cubitt, primarily for tea. And as I said, a lot of the warehouses around here were linked to foodstuffs. And this was, as you can imagine, a proper dock, a design dock that came in, Hayes Wharf, and it's where the tea clippers came. but as you can see now, now filled in, and this was one of the very first attempts back in the early 80s to, if you like, reconfigure and redesign warehouses for commercial, for eating and living and such things. And of course now all of them have been done this way. And this one now feels a little bit kitschy, I think. And here, in terms of going right back where we started in terms of Roman London, we're still outside the Roman settlement. This is still, would have been underwater, and we've still got to go a little bit further that way before we would have come back into the Roman town. And I still, even now, as I said, I'm just amazed how these spaces are now being used compared with how they've been used 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. It's incredible. And as I said, with the building of the Shard, you can't help thinking if we were to come back in 10 years' time, it would all feel different again. And some of the spaces we've been, particularly to the south, are going to feel very, very different.